Some disappearances don't begin with screams. There are no calls for help, no broken doors, no recorded moments of panic. It begins very quietly. A car stops by the side of a gravel road, the doors unlocked, 3 sets of footprints leading into the woods. And that's it. No running, no panic. Just normal walking, like everyone else who had walked into that forest before. But this time, the forest didn't let them out. 3 students, in their 20s, a short camping trip before final exams. Just 2 nights. A plan so simple that no one thought there was anything to fear. They weren't carrying any secrets. They weren't running away from anything. They just wanted some peace and quiet, a weekend away from the pressure, noise, and overwhelming expectations of student life. When the car was found, everything looked fine. Too fine. No signs of a struggle. No belongings ransacked. Just a car waiting for its owner to return, as if they were going to come back after a few hours' walk. But they didn't come back. The 3 sets of footprints were the last thing connecting them to the outside world. They led into the forest, then disappeared in an unexpected place. No one knew exactly what happened after that moment. No one heard a call. No one saw a flashlight beam in the night. There was only silence, stretching from Friday evening, through Sunday, and into the days that followed. A silence that could initially be explained, and then, a silence so heavy that it could not be ignored. 6 years later, the question remains. How could 3 people simply vanish in a few steps? And what in that forest held them back for so long? If you're listening here, remember one thing. Not every tragedy requires a villain. Sometimes, just one misstep, and a place we think is familiar, is enough to change everything. Linda Robert began counting down the days, not because she longed for adventure, but because she longed for peace and quiet. The final exam week at the University of North Georgia was always the same: stressful, sleep-deprived, and filled with invisible pressure. Stacks of coffee cups, conversations revolving solely around deadlines and grades. In that whirlwind, Linda wanted a moment to breathe. Linda is 22 years old. She's the type who lives by a plan. Everything in her life is meticulously organized, from her class schedule and part-time job schedule to small things like charging her phone or folding her laundry. Her friends often tease her for being overly controlling. But for her, control means security. When everything is well prepared, she believes that risk has no place to creep in. A short camping trip, just 2 nights, near the Blue Ridge Mountains, it sounded perfect to Linda. Not too far to be dangerous, not too long to worry about. Enough to get away from campus, enough to shut out the noise in her head. For Linda, it wasn't about escaping. It was about self-care in the way she knew how. Lucas Miller was different. At 23, Lucas was the kind of person who walked into a room and made everyone feel at ease effortlessly. He spoke confidently, laughed freely, and always seemed to know what he was doing. Among his friends, Lucas was the one who talked a lot about trails, altitude, weather, and his trips with his uncle in the Appalachian Hills when he was a child. In reality, Lucas's experience largely comes from weekend hikes and survival videos he watches online. But that doesn't diminish his confidence. Lucas likes the feeling of being relied upon. He likes it when others see him as a guide, someone who knows what to do if something happens. That role makes him feel useful, like he's a pillar of support. When Linda suggested the trip, Lucas readily agreed. For him, it was an opportunity to be a leader, to prove that his confidence was well-founded. He didn't think about the risks. He thought about the forest air, the feeling of freedom, and escaping the crowded city. James Walker was the quietest of the 3. At 21, James usually listened more than he spoke. He noticed the small details, the things others overlooked. When Linda talked about the camping trip, James was silent for a moment, not because he disagreed, but because he always considered things carefully before agreeing to anything. James wasn't an adventure seeker, nor was he looking for a challenge. For James, the trip was simply a way to avoid being alone during a stressful period of the semester. Sometimes, people agree to a trip not because of the destination, but because of the people they go with. James trusted Linda. And he trusted Lucas, at least enough to nod in agreement. The 3 of them studied environmental science and biology. They weren't a loud or flashy group of friends. Their friendship was forged through long lab sessions, group assignments, and late-night meals after class. There were no grand promises, no dramatic moments. Just familiarity, perseverance, and a very ordinary life. It is precisely this ordinariness that makes this story all the more painful. Because when you look at them, you see nothing unusual, no conflict, no secrets, no signs of danger. Just three young people, believing that a simple plan would get them out of pressure, only to bring them back again. They didn't realize that sometimes, the things that seem safest are the very things that make us complacent. And sometimes, a journey that begins with mutual trust is where fate silently awaits. In the 2 days leading up to departure, nothing seemed to indicate any unforeseen events. Everything unfolded exactly as a normal trip would. Linda carefully and neatly arranged her backpack on the dorm room floor. Her shoes were lined up, her jacket was folded neatly. A small piece of paper listing her essentials lay in the corner of her backpack, the handwriting neat and unhurried. Linda took a picture and posted it on social media. No posing, no showing off, just her gear ready for 2 days off from the pressure. The caption was short and simple: 2 days off before exam week. Good luck to us. Friends commented jokingly, reminding her to stay safe. No one felt the need to say anything more. Lucas prepared differently. He packed his things into the trunk of his car, comfortably, a little messy, but full of confidence. A tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, a few familiar camping items. Lucas filmed a short video from the driver's seat, smiling, pointing behind him, saying that he could finally leave the city. There was a sense of relief in his voice, as if all the hardships were about to be left behind. James didn't post anything. He rarely shared anything. But he did text. Texting his friends about his homework. Texting Linda to confirm the departure time. Short, concise messages, typical of him. No one thought those would be his last words. The night before she left, Linda checked her things one last time. She borrowed a power bank from a classmate. She reminded Lucas to bring extra water. She sent James a list of things he might forget. Lucas teased Linda for worrying too much. James replied with thanks. 3 different reactions, but all very familiar. The plan sounded so simple it was harmless. Drive a few hours north. Camp near the Blue Ridge Mountains. Hike during the day. Return before Sunday night. They told their families they might lose signal. That was normal in the mountains. Linda even liked the idea. Loss of signal meant no disturbances. It meant peace. None of the 3 were prepared for the risks. No one thought about getting lost, accidents, or unforeseen circumstances. They were preparing for 2 nights of rest, for the quiet, for the feeling that everything was still under control. That's the most dangerous kind of false peace. Peace comes from the belief that everything will go according to plan. And when people are too confident in their plans, they often fail to realize that there are places that don't care how well prepared we are. On Friday afternoon, they left campus while the sun was still high in the sky. The city behind them gradually emptied, the sounds of traffic fading with each mile. The journey began just like thousands of other college students' trips: no excitement, no drama, just a desire to arrive quickly and finally catch their breath. On the way, they stopped to refuel. A receipt was later found, showing the exact time and the familiar route leading north to Georgia. The cashier remembered Lucas as the most talkative, joking that he needed more coffee to stay awake to drive. No one was in a hurry. No one was stressed. The 3 of them looked like they were starting a normal weekend. The phone was still working. Linda texted her mother that they were almost there. A short message, enough to reassure those at home. Lucas recorded another video from the driver's seat. Trees lined the road, the music was soft, his voice gentle and cheerful. James texted a friend about the completed assignment, saying they would submit it together when they got back. The messages were small, very personal, but later became the final markers proving they were still there. Late in the afternoon, the car turned off the main road, onto a small lane leading to a parking area near the trailhead. It wasn't crowded, not frighteningly deserted, but secluded enough to offer a sense of privacy. The car was parked slightly askew on the gravel, as if Lucas just wanted to stop quickly and leave without much thought. A local passerby noticed the vehicle because it was carrying more luggage than necessary for a day trip. Through the window, the backpacks piled high could be seen in the back. The passerby clearly remembered 3 young people unloading their belongings, adjusting the straps, and chatting softly. No one seemed worried. Linda stood slightly apart, looking at her phone, perhaps checking the map, or perhaps trying to find a signal one last time. Lucas moved nimbly and confidently, as if familiar with the area. James stood closer to the car, his eyes scanning the trees ahead. Not panicked, just attentive. Like the instinct of someone who is always observing. There are no conversations with strangers. No warnings. No danger signs large enough to deter them. This trailhead is sparsely populated, but not off limits. It lies precisely on the boundary that makes people believe they are safe. Then they closed the car door, slung their backpacks over their shoulders, and walked into the forest. That was the last moment anyone saw them. Not in panic, not in the darkness, but in the late afternoon light, with laughter still lingering. After that, there were no more pictures, no cameras, no witnesses. Just a car, standing there motionless, as a promise that they would return. But that promise was never fulfilled. Friday night passed in the usual silence. No new messages, no calls. But in that mountainous region, silence wasn't unusual. The phone signal was intermittent. Messages sent sometimes took hours to arrive. Everyone simply assumed they were camping, chatting around the campfire, and going to bed early for their hike the next day. Saturday morning arrived, still no updates. But that didn't worry anyone. Linda had warned beforehand that there might be a signal loss. Lucas liked the feeling of not being disturbed. James was usually slow to respond. The silence was just part of the plan, a break they wanted. It was only after Sunday had passed that the silence began to take on a different form. In the dorm room, the power bank Linda borrowed was still plugged into the socket. The indicator light was on steadily. Her roommate noticed this. Linda never went anywhere without her phone. She never let her phone run out of battery. And she never ignored messages from her family. The feeling at that moment was hard to describe. Not panic, just a small deviation, but enough to make one stop and think. Elsewhere, Lucas's parents started calling. At first, it was just a casual call, a weekend habit. Then they called to ask when they were coming home. Then they called because they couldn't understand why the phone kept ringing and then hanging up. With each unanswered call, their calm thinned a little. By Sunday evening, those calls were no longer just inquiries. They had become waiting. James disappeared in a very James way. Quiet, without a word. But his friends on campus knew he'd arranged a study session. James had confirmed it. He wasn't one to change his mind. When James didn't show up and didn't text back, the void began to become apparent. On Monday morning, the comforting assumptions crumbled. Messages were sent, but there was no reply. Calls went to voicemail. The silence was no longer a respite. It began to feel like an unanswered question. Campus security was contacted first. The process was familiar. Usually, things like this end with an apology, a late call, a misunderstanding. But when they checked their dorm access cards, there was no sign that they had returned since Friday afternoon. Their room was untouched. No new items. No unpacked luggage. It was as if they had never been back. By then, silence was no longer just a gap between 2 messages. It became a clear absence, an absence that could no longer be explained by any familiar reason. And when people can no longer explain the silence, they are forced to name it. Disappearance. When officers arrived at the parking lot near the trailhead, Lucas's car was still there. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't covered. It was just parked slightly askew on the gravel, as if the driver had only intended to stop briefly and return immediately. The doors were unlocked. There were no broken windows. There were no signs of tampering or struggle. Inside the car, everything was still in order. Several half-empty bottles of water. A folded map lay on the front seat. Nothing important was missing. There was nothing that suggested panic. The car didn't tell a story of violence. It told a story of intention. They left the car with the belief that they would return. For those involved in search and rescue, that detail sent chills down their spines, because when people abandon their vehicles in fear, they often leave behind chaos. But here, everything felt like an unfulfilled promise. Search teams were deployed immediately. Park ranger led the way, followed by local police, volunteers, and sniffer dogs. The weather was favorable at the time. It was dry. The temperature wasn't too low. Conditions that everyone believed would ensure that if someone were lost, they would leave clear tracks. In less than an hour, the footprints were found. 3 sets, clear, in the same direction, leading from the parking lot into the woods. No running. No scattering. They were normal, steady steps, like any group of people starting a hiking trip. The sniffer dogs were very good at the beginning. They pulled their guide further in, confidently, as if the path ahead had been mapped out. But then the terrain changed. The ground began to slope steeper. Thick layers of dry leaves covered the soft soil beneath. The footprints were no longer sharp. They became increasingly scattered. Near a leaf-covered slope, the footprints clustered together, then stopped. There were no long skid marks, no signs of a struggle, no indication of anyone trying to turn around, just an abrupt end, where, from above, nothing was remarkable. The sniffer dog circled around, the scent faded, then disappeared completely. The guide stood still. No one said anything, but everyone understood. The path they trusted had just been cut short. The search teams fanned out. They went down the streams. They checked the side trails. They looked into every gap between the tree trunks. But there was no tent, no campfire, no rubbish, no sign that the 3 men had ever stopped to rest overnight. That makes the question even more serious. If they didn't have time to set up camp, then what happened before the first night? If they only walked for a few hours, why did the tracks disappear so quickly? The family stood at the edge of the search area, watching strangers carrying ropes and walkie-talkies into the woods. Each time a team returned, their eyes searched for the same thing: a nod, a sign, anything. But the forest remained silent. The car was still there. The footprints still ended at the same point. And between those two very specific things, there was an inexplicable void. A void large enough to swallow 3 people, just when they believed they were going in the right direction. In the following days, the forest was no longer as quiet as before. Helicopters circled overhead. Walkie-talkies crackled among the trees. Dozens of people fanned out in formations, carrying ropes, maps, and a faint glimmer of hope that, somewhere, the 3 students were still waiting to be found. The search area expanded daily. From the parking lot, they followed the main trails, then the less traveled side paths. The streams were thoroughly examined. Depressions, rocky areas, and small ravines were marked on the map. Each completed area was crossed out, as if gradually erasing hope with ink. The weather began to change. Light rains softened the ground, causing the tracks to fade quickly. Fallen leaves covered what remained. Each rain shower not only made the search more difficult, but also made it clear that time was on the forest side. The family was allowed to stand outside the restricted area. Not too close, but close enough to see. Linda, the mother, stood silently, her hands clutching the phone that had been silent for days. Lucas, the father, kept asking about the terrain, about the visibility from above, about the areas they couldn't reach. James's family spoke less, but their eyes followed each search team as they left and returned empty-handed. The first weekend passed without results. The atmosphere changed in the second week. Meetings were shorter. Voices were more subdued. Words were chosen more carefully. People began talking about the possibility of serious injury, about hypothermia, about scenarios nobody wanted to hear. The most dangerous areas were mentioned and then dismissed. Ravine was steep. The slopes were slippery. Places where access could put the searcher in danger. Commanders had to make difficult decisions. Team safety, or a very small chance. Probability was mentioned more often than human risk. For families, probability doesn't matter. They don't care whether it's low or high. They just know that if their child is there, then that's where they need to look. But the decision isn't in their hands. Vague accounts began to emerge. One person said they had seen 3 young people stray off the trail. Another remembered hearing voices in the woods Friday night. No one was certain. No one reported anything early. Each clue led to another dead end. Volunteers began to leave. Work, family, life brought them back. The map grew thicker with more diagonal lines. The remaining blank spaces became increasingly scarce. By the end of the second week, in a brief announcement, the official tone had changed. No longer was the emphasis on rescue. Instead, the language was softer, colder, withdraw, continue the search, reassess. That was the moment the family understood they were entering a new phase. A phase where hope was no longer protected. And in that vast forest, the three students seemed to have been swallowed up by time, even though only 2 weeks had passed. The forest is still there. People are still searching. But the answer remains elusive. Nearly 3 weeks after their disappearance, as the forest began to regain its silence, something unexpected happened. A signal, very brief, almost invisible, but enough to make every weary heart beat strongly again. A ping was recorded from Lucas's phone. No calls, no messages, not a single word was sent. Just the moment the device touched the cell tower, then fell back down immediately afterward, like a faint breath barely escaping from the darkness. The news spread quickly within the family, faster than they could have prepared themselves mentally. For those who had lived in silence for 3 weeks, even a small signal was enough to become a whole sky of hope. Linda, the mother, clutched the phone tightly, as if holding it just enough would make it ring again. Lucas, the father, didn't wait for an explanation. He only asked one question: where is he? Experts offered cautious explanations. In mountainous areas, positioning is inaccurate. The terrain causes signals to flicker on and off. It could be that the battery still had a little energy left. It could be that the weather conditions changed momentarily. It could also be a technical coincidence that will never happen again. No one dared to say for sure, but no one dared to completely deny it either. For the family, those explanations didn't matter as much as one thing. If the phone could transmit a signal, it meant it had been there. And if it had been there, then perhaps, just perhaps, they had been there too. The search teams were redeployed. The area was narrowed down. People returned to the slopes, the trails, the patches of forest they had traversed dozens of times. But this time, the mindset was completely different. It was no longer a duty. It was a desperate plea. 2 days passed, then 3. No more signals, no new traces. The ping didn't repeat. It stood alone in the record, like a question mark that refused to disappear. Ultimately, experts concluded that it was likely just a technical anomaly. A moment where hope and technology inadvertently intersected. To the investigators, it was a possibility. To the family, it was a fresh wound. That ping didn't bring them home, but it prolonged the wait. And in cases of disappearances, waiting is sometimes more painful than knowing the truth for sure. After 3 weeks, silence returned. But it was no longer the same. Because from that moment, everyone knew. There are signals that aren't meant to save people. They only appear to remind us that, somewhere in the darkness, this story is far from over. After that summer, the event didn't end. It just stopped moving. No more helicopters, no more maps hanging on the walls, no more morning search schedules. Only a state that's hard to name remained. Not complete hope, nor complete loss. A state in between, where time passes but the answer remains stagnant. 3 months after their disappearance, a memorial service was held. There were no coffins, no photos of the scene. Just candles, flowers, and carefully chosen words. No one dared say goodbye. People only said they would remember. Remember the little things. Remember how Linda used to remind everyone to be on time. Remember Lucas's laughter. Remember the comforting silence when James sat beside them. After the memorial service, Linda's room was closed, then opened again. Everything inside remained the same. The notebooks were stacked on the desk. The coat she had hesitated about whether to take with her. Her family didn't dare change anything. As if simply keeping things as they were, Linda would return and continue her unfinished life. Lucas's father chose a different way to survive those days without answers. He requested copies of the search maps. He learned to read the terrain, to read contour lines, to understand how the mountains and forests could conceal a person. On long evenings, he sat at his desk, circling areas that had been marked as inaccessible. Not because he believed people had made a mistake, but because he believed there were places too dangerous to look into, and that was precisely why the truth was being left behind. James's family withdrew into themselves. They refused interviews. They didn't participate in online forums. They didn't engage in debates with online theories. They chose to grieve in silence. They didn't need attention. They didn't need explanations from strangers. They simply wanted to keep James's memory to themselves. As time passed, the story began to live a different life on the internet. People shared images of the car. They redrawn the route from satellite imagery. They debated the missed details. The car was unlocked. The footprint stopped abruptly. And, most notably, a narrow ravine near where the sniffer dogs lost their scent. In initial reports, the ravine was only mentioned briefly. Too steep, too dangerous, low probability. Online, probability is irrelevant. People zoomed in on photos, compared them seasonally, pointing out how fallen leaves could conceal the edge of the ravine, how rain erosion could swallow up all traces. Some believed nature was enough to hide everything. Others believed there had to be something more. For the family, those debates were both comforting and torturous. Each new theory opened up a possibility, then closed again without proof. With each passing year, hope didn't disappear. It just changed shape, smaller, more cautious, and much heavier. They lived on. But no one truly got past that final moment. The three young people were held back at a fixed point in time, while the world around them went on. And in that in-between moment, the most painful thing wasn't the loss. It was not knowing what they were waiting for. 6 years have passed, and the mountain range is no longer the same. Storms have swept through repeatedly. Trees have fallen. Landslides have occurred. The familiar paths have been erased, replaced by new ones, formed by the footsteps of those seeking tranquility, just as they did years ago. For most visitors, it's simply a beautiful stopover. For the family of the three students, it remains an unanswered question. The man who discovered them didn't know their names. He was just a lone hiker in late autumn. After a major storm, a familiar trail was blocked by fallen trees, forcing him to turn onto an unofficial path along the ridge. He didn't take any risks. He walked slowly, keeping his distance from the edge of the slope, observing each step like someone familiar with the forest. The path narrowed. The ground was soft from years of accumulated dry leaves. Tree roots protruded from the soil, slippery and easy to fall. As he rounded a broken branch, his eyes caught sight of something not of the forest. A piece of cloth. Its color faded, caught on tree roots at the bottom of the slope. At first, he thought it was just old rubbish, a forgotten shirt. But the way the fabric was stretched taut, partially buried in the ground, made him stop. He moved closer to the edge, very carefully. And then, he saw more, not just fabric, but a shape, a pale, irregular patch of white, lying still beneath the leaves and soil. He stepped back. His heart pounded. The silence of the forest suddenly became heavy. He didn't climb down. He knew he shouldn't. He took out his phone, snapped a few photos from a safe spot, noted the coordinates, and left, following the same path he had come from. He didn't look back for long. There are things where just one glance is enough to know you've just stumbled upon something very significant. Less than an hour later, the park ranger arrived. The area was cordoned off. Those who had heard about the disappearance 6 years earlier began to notice the chilling coincidence. The location was near a narrow ravine, mentioned in the initial reports. At the time, it had been deemed too steep, too dangerous to descend and search thoroughly. This time they came down. Using ropes and safety equipment, the recovery team cautiously entered the ravine. The space below was narrower than expected. The light was dim. The ravine walls were steep. Layers of earth, rocks, and decaying leaves had accumulated, as if nature had deliberately concealed this place. And there, they found 3 sets of remains. Not scattered, not separated, but lying close together, in a confined space. Close enough to understand that everything happened very quickly, perhaps in just a few seconds. Someone slipped, a reflex pulled them down, and then, gravity did the rest. Around them lay the wreckage of a trip that never began. Fabric from a backpack, a broken flashlight, and a phone, its screen cracked, its body deformed from impact. James's phone, no battery, no data. But its presence alone is enough to bring an end to 6 years of waiting. Here they are. News spread very slowly, very carefully. No one wanted their family to find out through the press. Phone calls were made. Words were carefully chosen. When the truth was confirmed, the reaction wasn't like in the movies. There were no screams, no immediate collapse, just a very long silence, where hope and pain collided, then dissolved together. 6 years ago, they entered the forest believing they would return. 6 years later, the forest returned them, not by magic, but by truth. A silent truth lying in a place they had all passed through, but no one looked down upon. And only then did people understand. Some answers don't disappear. They just wait for enough time, enough change, to reveal themselves. Forensic work leaves no room for speculation. It relies on what remains, even though time has taken its toll. 6 years have passed. The soft tissue is gone. But the bones are still there, silently recounting what happened in their own way. Each skeleton was examined individually, then placed within a unified picture. The fractures had something in common: strong force, sudden, no signs of resistance, no signs of being bound or dragged, no injuries suggesting the presence of a fourth person, no story of violence, only the terrain and the moment. The conclusions were carefully considered, word for word. The cause of death was severe impact trauma, consistent with a fall from a great height. Environmental exposure was noted as a contributing factor, not to prolong life, but to explain why they were not found sooner. Experts reconstructed the final moments using weather and terrain data. That day, the clouds were low. The light faded earlier under the dense canopy of trees. The path narrowed, the edge of the ravine obscured by dry leaves and soft soil. Just one wrong step, one slip of the foot, enough to ruin any carefully prepared plan. Based on the location of the remains, it's highly likely Lucas was the first to slip. The natural reflex was for those behind him to try and hold on. But on the slippery, sloping ground, the pulling force became a pushing force. The accidents occurred in a chain reaction. Quickly. There was no time to understand what was happening. There was no chance to stop. The ravine was far deeper than it appeared from above. The walls were steep. The space was narrow. Sound was swallowed up. Even a call couldn't penetrate the layers of earth, rocks, and foliage. And then, the rain came. Leaves fell. Soil washed away. Each season added another layer to the truth that lay beneath. When the conclusion was presented to the family, no one argued. No one questioned the killer. Because there was no killer. Just a series of small events, occurring in a few brief seconds, but enough to change everything forever. Linda's mother listened, remaining silent for a long time. Knowing that her daughter wasn't suffering from prolonged fear didn't lessen her pain, but it gave the pain a clearer form. Lucas's father nodded as he listened to the explanation of the terrain. He had been visualizing this for years. James's family asked only one question: were the children together? And the answer was yes. The three were inseparable. No one was left behind. They fell into the same moment, the same accident, the same silence. The forensic report didn't work miracles. It didn't erase 6 years of waiting, but it gave the family something they'd been missing for too long: the truth. And sometimes, in stories like this, the truth, however painful, is the only thing that helps people begin to learn how to live on. This story doesn't end with the sound of an ambulance siren. There are no handcuffed villains. There's no dramatic climax. It ends very quietly. Quiet, just like the forest that held them captive for 6 years. Linda just wanted some peace and quiet before exam week. Lucas wanted to prove he was trustworthy. James simply didn't want to be alone. All three desires were very human, very ordinary. And precisely because they were ordinary, it was easy to forget that nature doesn't operate according to our plans. They didn't die from recklessness. They didn't die from lack of preparation. They perished because of a very small moment. A misstep, a slip of the ground, a place that looked familiar but was anything but safe. Sometimes, the line between safety and tragedy is just a few steps away, and we are never warned. 6 years of waiting have ended, not by miracle, but by truth. A painful, but necessary truth. Their family can finally name their pain. No more wavering between hope and fear. No more unanswered questions. If you've listened up to this point, take a moment to think about the detail that haunts you the most. The car unlocking. 3 footprints going into the woods and then stopping. Or the ravine, the place they all passed, but no one looked down. Please share your feelings in the comments. Not to argue, but so that these 3 people will be remembered, not just as an incident, but as lives that once had very simple desires. If you believe that stories like these need to be told, slowly, kindly, and with people at the center, please like and subscribe to the channel. Every interaction you have not only helps the video spread, but also gives buried stories a chance to be seen. Because sometimes the truth isn't far away. It's very close, right under our feet. In places we've walked through but haven't looked down to.